in the far northwestern regions of Russia, a short distance from the tiny stretch of border they share with Norway. There's a modest town. It's maybe a couple thousand people more than I reckon. The town is called, I'm going to butcher this, but Zapolyarny. It used to be a bigger town than it is now. It's been losing population for years. I suppose part of that is it's not really the most hospitable surroundings. Now, if you went there and you started walking through the brown and barren landscape around the town, and you were headed in just the right direction, you wouldn't have to walk or drive more than a couple miles before you came to what's left of what looks like a forgotten disaster zone. The ruins of some large building. Debris strewn all over the place. Just chunks of stuff littered everywhere. It looks like it's a plot of land that once had dreams of being a landfill when it grew up. Now if you go there, and you walk through the debris, in the middle of it, you'll find a rusted metal cap, no more than a foot wide at most, folded firmly into the ground. Now, I've always been afraid of dropping something down a hole and losing it. I keep very close watch over my keys because I do not trust myself not to lose it down sewer break or something. Now, in most cases, if I were to drop something valuable down most holes, more valuable than a quarter, I could probably hire some experts to help me recover it. If it were, say, if I were carrying around the Hope Diamond and I dropped it into a well, it would be worth it to fish it out, right? I think we can probably all agree it would be worth getting the Hope Diamond out of a well, and you can do that. But if you were at this spot in Russia, if you could unbolt that cap and you drop the Hope Diamond through the 9-inch hole in the ground beneath it, no matter what experts you hired, the Hope Diamond would never be seen again. Not till Jesus comes back, at least. You see, if the Hope Diamond tumbled into the hole under that cap, it would have a pretty interesting journey on its way down. It would eventually pass by some microscopic plankton fossils. It would go through endless layers of granite soaked in water. It would pass by or through mud boiling with hydrogen. And the deeper and deeper it fell, the hotter things would get, over 350 degrees, as it went all the way down in that hole. You see, the hole under that cap in Russia is called the Kola Super Deep Borehole. And it goes down quite a ways. I'm not talking 100 feet. I'm not talking 300 feet. I'm not even talking 3,000 feet. The Soviets had higher, or should I say lower, aspirations than that. This 9-inch wide hole goes down over 40,000 feet into the earth. That is over 7.5 miles. It's deeper than the deepest trench of the ocean. Now, you drop the Hope Diamond into that is goodbye to the Hope Diamond. That is unrecoverable. You see, there are a lot of holes we think of as deep. There are probably wells in some of our neighborhoods that we think are deep. There are lakes we think are deep. I think the Grand Canyon is pretty deep. But they are all jokes next to the Kola Super Deep Borehole. It's in the name, super deep. Now that is deep. Hold on to that picture. If you've been here the past week or so, you know we've been pressing our way through the incredibly dense and complicated arguments that Paul has been making as he tries to unpack the mystery of God's plans for history. Now, most places Paul writes letters to, he has to deal with Jewish groups who think that non-Jews, Gentiles, could only get into God's kingdom as second-class citizens, if at all. And Paul's nickname for those Jewish groups who think that way is Judaizers, who say you've got to become Jewish if you want to be a first-class citizen. Here in Rome, Paul has met the opposite problem. Non-Jewish Roman believers who harbor all the traditional Roman prejudices, especially after the Jews were kicked out of Rome for a season. And because of all that, these Roman believers think that God is now done with the Jews and has changed plans. And Paul says, not so fast. Because Paul sees something different at work. Paul says that all of history, from Moses down to the very end, could be split into three big chunks. And here, Paul says, is where God gets clever. For the first long stretch we read about in the Old Testament, Israel had a lot of special privileges it usually kept to itself. And as you read the Old Testament, you'll see Israel is in the spotlight. Israel is center stage. They are center of God's plan to ultimately bless all the world, but in blessing it through Israel, Israel has a lot of privileges to enjoy. Now, during that time, all the other nations were lost, for the most part, waiting. Paul says God shut them up under disobedience. If you picture it as a race, Israel was way ahead. Nobody else even got the memo. They were supposed to get on track with it. Because Israel was responsible for getting that out. Well, we know how that worked. All of this was what Israel expected. They figured that when they crossed the finish line, then the word would go out, and the last generation from each nation could come and walk through and cross the line and join in the after party. And get some consolation prizes along the way or something. Now, as it turns out, that is not what God wanted for them. So Paul says, after Jesus came, most of Israel tripped over him like the stumbling stone the prophets talked about. Most of Israel got, not all, but most, got broken off like branches from an olive tree. That's the picture Paul uses. We talked about that. Paul explains, hey, God's just leveling the playing field here. The purpose of Israel's stumble in God's plan, Paul says, is just to give all the other nations a chance to catch up and get ahead. And that's what we're seeing now in the second stretch. Disciples from all nations joined together with Israel's small but faithful remnant are out in front. And that's what the Romans have been seeing, and they assume from this that God just doesn't want Israel making it. Paul tells them, oh, hold your horses now. Because there's a third part to this story. The idea is when Israel sees so many nations getting ahead of them, it'll motivate them to get back up in the third stretch, get into Christ, get with the program, catch up with the rest of God's church, and then Israel and the nations can all cross the finish line together. Photo finish. A real time. Israel and all nations tied for first place. Gold medals for everyone. And that, Paul says, is what God is aiming at. Last week, exploring what Paul is saying here can be pretty rough. After all, Paul is taking aim at our ideas and our prejudices, and he's trying to deflate them. He's poking our balloons till they pop, which is never pleasant. I'm sure it wasn't pleasant for the Roman churches either. It's humbling to see how God's plan is bigger than us, and nobody really likes being humbled that way. God is acting in a way nobody could have expected, nobody could have predicted, and it's hard to understand even when Paul explains to us what God is doing. I have a hard time understanding what Paul's saying here. Several of you shared with me last week that you had a tough time with last week's message too. How should we feel though? To the extent we can understand what Paul's unpacking, how should we feel with it? And that's the question for this week. Well, Paul would like to start off by telling us how he feels. He points at God and he just falls to pieces in overwhelmed worship. Oh, death of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments! How inscrutable are his ways! Paul just, his mind is blown. Looking at this entire plan, he's just had revealed to him. He says God is deep. 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 Super deep. Really deep. The depths of God are deep, like the Cola super deep borehole is deep, and then deeper still. The depths of God have many dimensions. Paul highlights just 3 here in his song of worship. And that's what we're looking at this morning. And first, Paul says, God is deep in what he knows. Oh, depth of the knowledge of God. The knowledge of God goes so much deeper than any hole we've ever dug or any hole we could ever dig. The knowledge of God stretches from the heights of the heavens to the heart of the earth and back. And for Paul, exhibit A of how deep the knowledge of God must be is this: God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. You see, God knew all the way back when he was talking to Abraham. God knew all the way back when he was introducing Adam to Eve. He knew all the way back before he said, "Let there be light." He knew all the way back then exactly what Israel would be like. He knew all their successes and all their failures. He knew all the moments of tenderness and all their hard-hearted, stiff-necked, hard-headed scenes of rejection. All their virtues and all their vices, all their credits and all their foibles. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind. Israel's rough and rocky heart, like the heart of any nation or any person, is a disaster zone, shrouded in mud and debris and darkness and storm, spinning wildly and erratically in its sickness. The heart of a person or a nation is hopelessly murky. The heart is the least knowable thing the prophets can think of on the face of the earth. But God knows it. God knew it long already. He knew it comprehensively. He knew the heart of Israel, what made him tick. And he knows the heart of every nation. He knows how we will or will not respond to the good news, and when. And best of all, he knew us. He knew we'd run the race. He knew we'd need all the help we could get. So those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. The knowledge of God is so much deeper than we can imagine. You could pile the knowledge of God in a stack all the way down the Cola super deep borehole, and the knowledge of God would be infinitely deeper still. So why should we be surprised when God outsmarts us? For who has known the mind of the Lord? Paul quotes Isaiah asking. God's knowledge is too deep for us to get a handle on. So often, we fall to thinking that we can outfox God. We think we can get ahead of Him. We think we can see what He's up to. We can crunch the numbers and predict where He's headed. Get real, Paul would say. Who among you knows what's actually going on in the Lord's mind? Not me. Not you. Nobody but the Son and the Spirit, who alone searches everything, even the depths of God. And if that's true, who's to say that whatever comes your way, God doesn't know something you don't? Who's to say that when you can't see a way forward, it isn't plain as day in God's sight? Who's to say when you can't explain what's going on that it isn't elementary, dear Christian, the way God knows? With as deep as His knowledge is, as deep as His knowledge goes, we cannot possibly give God too much credit. He knows so much we can't fathom. Nothing takes Him by surprise. There is nothing that has not been factored into His calculations. His knowledge is deep enough to encompass everything you're going through, or have gone through, or will go through, or might go through. His knowledge is deep enough to know what you can handle and what you can't. And more importantly, what Christ can handle in you. All we can do, all we need to do, is get down on our knees and trust Him. Oh, depth of the knowledge of God. Secondly, God is deep in His wisdom. Oh, depth of the wisdom of God. We are told all over the Bible that God is wise. Paul calls Him, later on, we'll get to this in a few weeks, calls Him the only wise God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding, Proverbs 2:6. In wisdom did God make all the things He created. For the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding He established the heavens. The prophets tell us God is wonderful in counsel and excellent in wisdom. To God belong wisdom and might. Oh, depth of the wisdom of God. Now, in particular, what brings this home for Paul is looking at the way God organized history. It would have been so easy to just let Israel win the race like they always figured they would. To have them come crashing through the finish line, get the gold medal, and then pal around with a couple silver and bronze medal nations who came screaming to Zion in the last day. That would have been easy. Too easy. It also would have been easy to trip Israel up, let them stumble and fall, disqualify them from the race, and then have gold medals for civilized nations like the Romans thought they were. The Roman churches. Easy. Too easy. God had something more complicated in mind. He had something wiser and better and more fruitful in store. God figured out a way to stretch His mercy so much further than any of us have ever dreamed. In His wisdom, He skillfully wraps His mercy around Jews and non-Jews, around Israel and every nation, so that none might be left as second class. That's the wisdom of God. The wisdom of God is so deep, there is no division, there is no hostility that he does not have a plan to bring together. White and black, red and blue. In God's wisdom, in Christ, that dividing wall of hostility can be broken down. For broken families, God's wisdom has a plan. For broken countries, God's wisdom has a plan. For broken lifestyles, God's wisdom has a plan, and his plan will unfold, especially in his church, so that, Paul says, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. And what Paul is getting at, how dare the Romans try to second-guess God? How dare they think they can dictate to God who is and who isn't acceptable to him on their terms? For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Paul asks. He's getting these questions from Isaiah. Isaiah was talking at a moment when it looked like Israel had fallen apart. Israel was downtrodden. Israel was a reject. The nations were ruling big and proud, and God reminds them, hey, all the nations, drop in the bucket. God has plans to restore Israel. Isaiah asks all the nations, wait, do you really think that God needs to come to you, to your nation, to your people, for your advice on whether he can or should pull this off? Is that really what you're thinking? Paul's got the same question. For the prejudiced in the Roman church, do you really think God needs your advice? Are you God's counselor? Really? Really? So often we think God needs our advice. We think God needs to conform to our ideas, to our wisdom, to our prejudices and agendas and petty disputes with each other. When we hear God tell us to abstain from sexual immorality, and that neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor those who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. Well, we take that, and there are plenty of churches and plenty of professing believers who want, in that statement, to suddenly be God's counselor and want to advise him to loosen up on what he has said. Who are we to be his counselor? Oh, but then when we hear God tell us that when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him no wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you the same as the native among you. You shall love him as yourself. When God tells us to not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, well, then again, there are plenty of churches, plenty of professing believers who all of a sudden want to be God's counselor. And then when we hear Jesus say, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Well, there again, we want to be God's counselor. And when things just aren't working out for us, and when we can't understand what God is doing or why, and we think he's making a mess of things and we start doubting, we want to be God's counselor, but we can't. We aren't. God does not need our advice. His wisdom is too deep for him. No wisdom, no understanding, no counsel can avail against the Lord. His judgments are unfathomable. His ways are untraceable. We've got no view behind the scenes. We cannot track his footprints. We cannot piece together the clues. We cannot get ahead of him. Just trust. Obey. Be amazed at his wise plan as it unfolds. And then third, God is deep in his riches. Oh, depth of the riches of God. And there are a lot of things that means. And one of them is he's far too rich to ever be in our debt. Who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid, Paul asks. Paul's quoting what God said to Job. Who has first given to me that I should repay? Paul says, we are debtors. God never is. God will never owe you anything. All that God gives, he gives it as a gift, as merciful grace, in the measure he has appointed. We can never be so good that we entitle ourselves to extra special treatment. We cannot work so much that we end up putting God into our debt. Nor can we convince ourselves so strongly and call it faith that we put God into our debt. His riches are just too deep for that to happen. Now the other side of that is that God is richer in blessing than we are in imagination. No eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. We know that verse. God is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think. We know that verse. But think about it. God is richer in blessing than you are in imagination. When you pray for this thing or that thing, your imagination is consistently coming up short of what God really aims to give you. And you can trust that he will. God is far more eager to forgive you than you are to be forgiven by him. God is far more eager to provide for you than you are for his provision. God is far more eager to comfort you in your distress than you are in your distress to be comforted. And God is far more eager to prosper you than you are to be prospered. Only remember, his value system is higher, his timing is more far-sighted. See again the depths of his knowledge and the depths of his wisdom. But know beyond a shadow of a doubt, he is far more rich in blessing than we are in imagination. Try as hard as you might to conjure up a picture of what he'll give you someday. And you can rest assured your mental picture does not hold a candle to what he has actually planned. And even now, even amidst our trials and tribulations, whatsoever they may be, God is richly blessing us under our radar. We only have to wait in patient faith to see his rich blessings blossom richly. He could pile the stack of blessings he has just with your name on it, all the way into the cola super deep borehole, and that hole could not hold them all. Couldn't hold them all. Not if they were written paper thin. Couldn't hold them all. For another thing, the depth of God's riches means that his divine holdings, if you will, are vaster and more diversified than any stock portfolio known to man. Now we've heard him say in the Psalm that every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. The world and its fullness are mine. Like he said to Job, whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. And not only that, but then we hear what Moses says to Israel. To the Lord your God belong heaven, and the heaven of heavens, the earth and all that is in it. For from him are all things. creator of everything that's out there. Every cat, every plant, every person, every water droplet, every mountain, every molecule of oxygen, every far-flung galaxy, every comet whirling its way through the celestial realms. To the Lord your God belong heaven, the heaven of heavens, the earth, with all that's in it. And through him are all things. He's the sustainer who keeps all things in existence. They owe their being. We owe our being. This pulpit owes its being to a continual, moment by moment grant of mercy from the mind of the Lord, deliberately choosing for it to exist. For through him are all things, and to him are all things. He's the goal. It's all aiming toward, which is why he is, in the end as in the beginning, the owner. And so it's no wonder Israel couldn't fall by the wayside. It was and is his, and to him are all things. Same with the nations. To him are all things. The greatest diversity there is in what belongs to God. In our culture today, we speak so much of diversity, but the greatest diversity there is what belongs to God. If you turn away from him to just what you have and what you are and what you know and what you have experienced, immediately you are limited. You are reducing the variety and the diversity and the richness, because God's riches are by definition deeper and more comprehensive and more diverse. For from him and through him and to him are all things. So is there anything he can't provide if it's wise for him to give it to us? So shouldn't we trust him to provide all he says he'll provide and give us all he says he'll give us? Yeah. Oh, depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. There is so much about God that is far beyond our ability to explore. And the only appropriate response to that is not arrogance or seeking our own prejudices and traditions and ways. And the only appropriate response is not doubt and skepticism and withdrawal. The only appropriate response is humble faith. Yet a humble faith that reaches out to what can't be searched out. Because we read that God is determined in the coming ages to show us the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. His aim is that we might reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Unsearchable riches of Christ are God's plan for us in the manifold wisdom of God. This mystery, hidden for ages and generations, now revealed to his saints, presents us with the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. So the only response to the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God that make possible to us this hope of glory, whereby mercy in Christ is stretched over all, the only response that fits is to glorify God, which is what Paul writes here. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So often in our lives, so often in our society, so often, sad to say, even in churches, we are content running along under our own steam, choosing our own adventure. We're content to relegate God to the margins. put him in the sidelines, to bench him, send him to the bleachers. We know that he'll be there then if we decide we need something from him, but otherwise we glance over like he's a sideshow, and then we get back down to what we're all about. That's the way we live in the 21st century. But to glorify God is to acknowledge him as the center, as the one from whom and through whom and to whom are all things. And here, bringing it all together, is Paul's point. A God so deep must be a God so central. A deep center. A center deep in riches and deep in wisdom and deep in knowledge is exactly what is needed in our world and in our lives and relationships. Now, for the past decade and more, the Cola super deep borehole has been closed up and sealed off. But a deeper God can never be closed up and can never be sealed off. His depths are greater. We can't get to the bottom of it. We cannot get to the bottom of his riches. We cannot get to the bottom of his wisdom. We cannot get to the bottom of his knowledge. We cannot get to the bottom of his love. So in all humility and in all faith, let us forever glorify this God so merciful, so loving, so gracious, so knowing, so wise, so rich, so central, and so super deep. And we end with that one word Paul ended his song. Amen. Amen. Let's pray.